All right, so I'm going to do a few demonstrations. The first demonstration I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a little bit about some network equipment that you would typically see in a business, and so just so you can kind of understand what that might look like. It's in my home, but it's very similar to what some of you might have for devices, just a little bit more enterprisey and geared more towards geeks and stuff like that. But what I have is very similar to what you'd see in a corporate network. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some of the basic networking tools that can be used to troubleshoot problems with your internet connection. And then I will also be showing you the domain name system, which is used, also known as DNS, which is like the phone book of the internet. It helps to map the IP addresses that every computer has with recognizable names that we can remember and things like that. And then lastly, I'm going to go ahead and just do this at the same time as I do these other things, is I'll talk a little bit about information security, and I'll show you some products that you can use to secure your computer. So when you go to the syllabus to look for the videos, when you click on either link, they're going to go to the same place. Okay. With that, so let's start off with looking at a network infrastructure. So I have basically software and hardware from a company called Ubiquiti. Cisco's another major network vendor. Juniper is another major vendor for network gear. Okay. So when I log in, I can see some things, and I want to explain them because they're relevant to the course. Okay. First of all, I have a network. I have a local area network. I also have a wide area network, which connects me to the internet. And so you can see on here that I have an internet service provider, my ISP, and my speed is 500 megabit per second. Okay. Now you can go out and you can do speed tests on your own connection. You can go Google speed tests and you'll find various sites that do speed tests. But this shows you a couple things. First of all, if you look here at the bottom, this is the download speed of your internet. And we can see that mine right now, I'm paying for 500 megabit, but I'm actually only getting 492.7 megabits per second. Okay. This one here is an upstream. So the download is how fast I can download things. The upstream speed is how fast I can upload things. Mine are very similar, but a lot of times they're not similar. A lot of times you'll have a fast download speed, which means you can download software and videos and whatever over the internet pretty quickly, but your upload speed is much slower. Okay. So your upload speed means when you get on Zoom, you have problems with Zoom because you're sending data to another location. And then there's this thing called latency. Okay? The lower the number here, the better. So when I did this test last night, I was getting latency of 6 milliseconds. I'm getting 14 right now, and I can probably explain why I'm having these issues right now. Number one, although I've stopped working for the day, my wife is still upstairs working, and she's doing Zoom and other things, which are using up both the bandwidth that I have here, and they're also probably slowing down the network in general. Okay. So that's one thing. You can go run a speed test. You can download software, do it from a web browser. And then this just is a graph that shows me over time what this looks like. Now, if we look at my network, we can see that I have, using very little of my capacity right now, I have several different devices. So let me explain what these are. This first one is my router. Okay, the Stream Machine Pro is just the brand of my router. Okay, and a router, as we talked about in the lecture, is a way to make sure that traffic gets from place to place on the internet. Okay. I also have switches. Okay. And switches are used to allow different devices to connect in the data transfer between devices to occur. It effectively switches the information back and forth. So when I send out data, it all can't go over the physical wire at the same time unless I've got a really big wire. So I have switches that then route the data using the router, but they allow multiple devices to connect. So if you're at UCR, you'll notice there are rooms across the campus labeled like IDF or something along those lines. Those rooms are where the switches are. And then all the offices and the wireless access points in the building connect back to these switches. Okay? Which brings me to the next piece, the wireless access point. And in my house, I have multiple access points and they're not physically connected to my router directly. So many people's router is also their access point. It's an easy, cheap way to do it for a home. But I have more complex network needs here. So I have separate access points, and I have one upstairs, one downstairs, and they service clients as people move around the house. Okay? And we can see here that we have 17 devices that are using the Wi-Fi and 4 that are using the wired connections. And I also have 6 devices that are, sorry, there's a total of apparently 8 devices here that are considered guests. Okay, so I have certain devices that I don't trust, and so I have a guest network for those. I don't want them to potentially do bad things on my network. Okay, and so now let's look a little bit about some of these things here. So first of all, I can do a map. Okay, and so if I look at this map, I can see what's called a topology of my network. And so I can see that I have my router, which is connected to a switch, which is connected to a few things. First of all, off my switch, I have my lighting system is directly connected to the switch. I have an access point connected to the switch. I also have an upstairs Wi-Fi that's connected to the other Wi-Fi. And then lastly, I have another switch here in my office, which connects my devices in my office. Okay. Now, I can do things with, you can't do this with a lot of devices, but one of the benefits that businesses have is they have devices with intrusion protection and detection systems, as I talked about. So in this case, I have an intrusion protection system which blocks access from a lot of different countries. Okay? Now, I can't possibly block all the countries, so I block the countries where most of the attacks come from. And so if I notice that there are attacks come in a particular area, I can go and I can change countries. Okay? But this is what the default configuration of this device was. I can go in, and if there's threats, I can go and see what those threats were. I can see the status of scanning if there are open ports. So this allows me to see what type of security risk I have on my network. Okay. And then I can even set up what's called a honeypot. Okay, so if you know Winnie the Pooh, he loves honey. Okay. So the theory is you throw a honeypot out, people will find it, and they're going to want to go eat the honey. And if they're eating the honey, they're not doing other things with your network. So that's kind of theory behind a honeypot. But I don't have anybody trying to hit the honeypot that I have. All right. So this is my network, and this is how I access it and I set it up. But this is fairly simple. Businesses are going to have a much more complex network that they will use for their purposes. And so now that brings me to the second piece that I wanted to talk about, and it's some of the basic utilities that we use on our computer. So my computer has this interface here, which is a command line interface. And some of you are doing the command line interface homework assignment. Okay, so you get a little familiar with this. On the Mac, we have this app called Terminal. So if you go up here and you search for Terminal, that's how you find it. A PC has one too. It's called PowerShell or the command prompt. Okay. And so what I can do is I can do a variety of different things. So the first thing I can do is called ifconfig on Mac and Linux machines, and on Windows it's called ipconfig. Okay, so this is for Mac, and then for PC, Windows, you have this. Looks like this. Oops. Okay. Now, I have a Mac, so I have to do it this way, but I'm going to show you what this thing does for me. So if I scroll up here, well, this is all my different network interfaces on my computer here. And so we can see that I have an IP address here. This is an IP address. This is INET. Okay, this stands for internet. And this tells me what my IP address is. Now, a couple of things here. First of all, I have an IP address here, and it's probably very similar to what all of you have. Right? And yours probably either start with a 192, a 10, or a 172. Those are private IP ranges. Okay? What that means is I can have the same IP address as you might, and it's not an issue. But on the regular internet, we can't do that. So my router is hiding my real internet IP address. And for obvious reasons, I'm not going to share that with all of you. But if you go to whatismyip.com, you'll get a website that will tell you what your external internet-facing IP address is. And then everything else you see on your computer is your internal IP address. Okay. So I know my IP address is here. I know it's a private address because of the type of address it is. But that doesn't really help me. All I know is my internet, my machine's got an internet connection. Or let me rephrase that. My machine's got a LAN connection. It's got a local area network connection. Whether I have connectivity to the internet or not is depending on my router. Okay? So now I can see, first of all, do I have a connection to my router? So let me try to get to Google. Okay? And if I do trace route does a router. Basically, a route prints out the routes to get to this destination. And so if we look very closely here, traceroute does two things. First of all, I'm going to www.google.com. In the background, that DNS thing I'm going to talk about in a second happened. And it looked up who is google.com, and it gave me an IP address for Google. This is a public-facing IP address for Google. Okay? And so the first thing it does is it hits my router. Okay? So you can see I have a router here with an IP address. So when I went out and did that trace route, it's able to go out and figure out how to get to Google, and it starts with my router. And the way it does that is it goes out to my router and says, I need to get to 142.250.68.100. Do you know how to get to that? And my router doesn't have a clue. He's like, dude, I don't have a clue what you're talking about. Let me send you to the next router in the list. And it will then pass it up to the router at my ISP. And then the same thing happens to that router. Hey, dude, do you know who 142.250.68.100 is? And Frontier's router says, dude, I don't have a clue. Let me send you up to the next router up. And that keeps happening until we get to a router that knows who, where that IP address is at. Okay? Once the router knows where the IP address is at, it then sends you to that location. Okay? And then once you get to that location, you connect to a server. That server is probably running, in this case, it's a www, so it's running a web server. And on that end, you connect to that actual IP address of that machine, just like I'm on a machine. Google has a machine, except Google has a lot of machines, as we'll talk about next week when we talk about e-commerce. Google has tens or hundreds of thousands of machines out there, okay, servicing just google.com. So they have a lot more machines. And the mechanics of how they do that gets to be really complex and outside the scope of this course. However, for those of you who are IS majors, I did post a link to a conference that will be held in a few weeks that I will be attending. And that conference talks about some of the underlying technologies required in order to facilitate having that many servers for your website. Okay? Google had to create a lot of things in order to make that feasible. Okay? Now, traceroute is one way we can find out what's going on. So let's say I want to go to Microsoft. Let's say I want to go to UCR. Okay? How do I get to UCR? Okay? And so it's telling me that it's going to trace route to this IP address. Okay? My first attempt is through the router, my local router here. And then I can't, my router doesn't know anything about UCR, so it goes to this one. That doesn't know anything about UCR, so it goes to this one. That doesn't know anything, so now it goes to this one. And now it gets to this one, which is apparently looking like it's the last one, where it's now going to then go to that website. But because of security reasons, a lot of companies block access to traceroute, so you won't be able to see the full path. But at least I know my internet's working, okay? Because I can get out to the internet here. Now there's another utility that we can use called ping. Okay? This is another utility that oftentimes won't work because of security reasons. But I can do ping, and this allows me to test to see whether my network connection is working properly or not. So I can ping www.google.com and I get a response back. And that tells me that I can get to google.com. Okay? Now, I talked about the DNS. And so DNS is actually a really interesting character. I don't know any of us who remember each other's phone numbers anymore. Okay? It used to be that you'd memorize everybody's phone numbers. Now there's no need. We have cell phones and phone books and things like that. So we don't need to memorize people's numbers. But we can't possibly memorize the IP address of every server on the internet, not to mention they change all the time. Okay? So we have to be able to find a better way to find things on the internet. And so that's where DNS comes in. Think of it like the phone book. Okay? So if I say, I want to do a lookup, there's a couple different utilities. I'll show you a few of them. Okay? So if I want to find who google.com is, I can use what's called NSLOOKUP. That stands for Name Service Lookup. Okay? And it tells me that Google is this IP address. I can also do dig, which is another way of saying the same thing. It just outputs it in a little bit different format. Okay? I can also do host google.com. And I can then see that Google has an IP address here. But we don't just have websites on the internet. Okay? So we can look at google.com from a bit broader perspective. So the first time I did www, the second time I just did the basic google.com. So I can see a couple of different things here. Number one, the IP address has changed for google.com since the last time I was out there. Okay? There is mail addresses as well. Okay? So when we get mail to our Google account, the mail has to know how to get there. And so how does it know where to go? There's a special type of DNS record just for email. Okay? It's called a mail exchanger record. You don't need to worry about that. That's not on the test. Okay? Don't worry. But it's good to know that DNS is not just websites. Okay? DNS is used for websites and mail and applications, and it's used for even other things that are way beyond the scope of this class. Okay? It can even be used as a simple database. So we can see here that email for Google is being handled by these 5 servers. Okay? So if I picked one of them, it now tells me the IP address of that mail server. Okay? So anytime I have a problem, and let's say I'm in my web browser and I'm trying to go to google.com and it doesn't work, the first thing that I can do is we'll go to another website. Does that one work? And if it doesn't work, there could be a couple things happening. Number one, it could just be a problem with your browser. Okay? But before we go through and try to figure out other issues, let's just do some simple tests. Can we even look up what Google's IP address is? Maybe that's a problem. Maybe it's a DNS problem. So if I can do a host google.com and nothing comes back, then I probably have a DNS problem. Okay? Now, Google provides public DNS servers. So if your DNS isn't working, you can go into your computer settings and you can change it. And one of their DNS servers that they use is 8.8.8.8. So if your regular DNS servers don't work, you just go into your network settings and you change that to one of Google's servers and try looking it up again. And if it still doesn't work, you might have another issue. So that's where Traceroute comes in. Okay? Traceroute can let you see, are you able to get out to the internet? Okay? And then the last thing here is the ifconfig. Do you even have an IP address? If you don't have an IP address, you can't get on the internet. Okay? Now, if I go back here and we look at one of these, we see a problem actually, and I didn't point it out before, but there is a problem here. I have 2 internet connections on this machine. Okay? This one is my wired connection. Okay? I've got it plugged in. When I'm working, I would rather have a wired connection. It's more reliable. Okay? This one's my wireless, which I actually have turned off. But for whatever reason, my computer still thinks it's on here. Okay? I look at the little screen here, and on the graphical side, it's turned off, right? But my computer still thinks it's on. And so as a result, it still has an IP address. But don't be fooled, this is not a real IP address. If your computer ever has an address that starts with 169, this is not a real IP address. Okay? This is indicating you have a problem with your computer. And this happens a lot on Windows computers. Okay? So you can't get on the internet, you can't figure out why, you check your IPs, you have a 169 address. You do not really have an IP address. Okay? Your computer has something wrong with it. And sometimes just rebooting will fix the problem. Sometimes you have deeper problems you're going to need to talk to a tech support person for. Okay? So that's DNS. That's kind of the basics of networking. I want to also talk a little bit about security. So we have the ability to do security on our computers for a variety of things. We have a ton of passwords, all of us. We also have things like encryption. Okay, so let me see if I've done it on this computer. I have not. So I will come back to that in a second. All right, so from a security perspective, there's a number of things we can do. And I talked about them in the lecture, but let me just show you. On a Mac, you can go into security and privacy, and there's a lot of different settings you can go in here and turn to give yourself more privacy. But what I want to focus on is a couple of things. Number one, even if you have a router which has a firewall, you should always have your firewall on your computer. Okay? This just protects you. Let's say you connect at UCR and you get on your computer and you don't have your firewall on. There are people at UCR who are engineers and hackers and things like that. They could probably get into your computer. So if you have your firewall on, that's just one additional step they have to go through in order to try to get into your computer and access your data. Okay? So turn on your firewall. FileVault, turn that on. Now, I want to explain why I don't have it on in this computer. This is not the computer I normally use for this class. This is my server at home that I use for testing stuff at work. And if I test stuff at work with FileVault on, some of the software I use won't work properly because the disk is encrypted and it can't actually use it. So because this computer has no actual data on it, I don't store anything on it, it's just for testing and work-related testing, I don't have FileVault on. But on my real computer, I have FileVault on. And the reason for that is if someone gets physical access to my computer, okay, so imagine it for a moment. Someone breaks into your apartment and gets access to your computer. If you have FileVault on, they cannot access your data even if they can reset your password. Okay? If you have FileVault off, or you don't have some other type of encryption on, then they can access all the data on your computer, and that could be even cached passwords and things like that, okay? So you wanna make sure you enable the encryption. In the business world, you absolutely need to do this thing, okay? If your IT department doesn't do it for you, you should ask that question. How can I encrypt my data? Because you are the weakest link in the organization, and if you don't encrypt your data, the hackers are gonna love it, and the people who steal your machine are gonna love it, and your customers are gonna dislike it very much. And it might even cause your company to go out of business, okay? So that's very important that you have that turned on if you have a machine with data on it. Another simple thing is requiring a password when your computer goes to sleep or a screensaver begins. Okay? This is not my work computer. I mean, I mentioned I use it for work. It's a test box for me. So there's no data on it. There's no company information. I just use it for testing, and then I record things that I'm doing for putting onto my work computer to go and write up the documentation that I have to do. So this one, I have it for 5 minutes, mainly because it annoys me when I stop working on this computer for a second to go do something on my other computer, and I come back and immediately locks on me, okay? In a business environment, you generally will have it immediately lock, or you have a 5-second rule, okay? That's generally what most companies do. Because by the time you get up from your chair, you walk away, your computer is locked, okay? Now, another area is apps downloaded here. Unless you are a computer geek, you should have this set to App Store only. Okay? You only want to allow apps downloaded from the App Store, and then you want it to prompt you to install anything else. And the reason for that is, what if you accidentally go to some website that they install software on your computer? Okay, same thing with Windows, by the way. I'm showing you on a Mac, but the same principle applies on Windows. If you are a little bit more tech savvy, you can do identify developers, and then it won't prompt you for things from developers that Apple knows about. Okay? And then the password. Okay? You should do complex passwords. And so let me give you an example of a complex password here. Okay? So let's say my dog's name is Fido. Okay? So I could say that, my dog's name is Fido, and he is brown. Okay. That would be a very complex password. It's very long, right? And it's easy for me to remember. And I've added some differences with capital letters. Now I could go a little bit further and say, my dog's name is, do something like that, Fido. Okay. I add more complexity here, but then I'm more likely to forget what my password is. Okay. Now, one way is to do that. Another way is to use a password manager, so I don't even need to know what my passwords are. And so there's various password managers out there, but be sure it's a credible one. So I use LastPass, okay? And LastPass has a mobile app and things like that. And I'm just going to take you there. This isn't a computer that I use LastPass on, but it allows you to store all your different websites and your passwords. It allows you to automatically generate passwords of whatever complexity you want. And you can also have it change it automatically. Okay? And it shows you how good the password is with this little bar. So let's say that LinkedIn has a hack again and your LinkedIn password gets stolen. Okay? You can have LastPass go out and automatically reset your LinkedIn password for you if it gets hacked. Okay? But even if they get your LinkedIn password, they don't have your Amazon or your Facebook password. So that's the advantage of having multiple passwords for each site having its own. It's a good practice to get into. Okay. Another one is, I think it's called 1Password. Yeah. So here's another one that's out there. Okay, 1Password, and you can take a look at what the product features are. But this has the ability to keep your password safe as well. It's kind of the same thing as LastPass. They work very similar. Okay. Matter of personal preference. The bad news is you can get some of these for free, and some of them cost a little bit of money. Okay? So 1Password looks like it costs a little bit of money. LastPass, I think it has a free version. Yeah, there's a free version here. So there's actually no reason why you wouldn't be able to go out and do a free version of this. Okay? All right. I think that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and post this. And please, during the Q&A session, feel free to ask me questions. I'm happy to answer them. I like questions. I'll make these all AMAs so I get good participation out of all of you. Okay? I want to be able to help you, and I think Matt likes answering your questions as well. Okay?